Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 17th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Since 1990, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions are available on archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nickleson for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is an extinction edition of News from Neptune, from Palestinians to the rest of us. Several discussions we want to highlight tonight. One particularly that I will put a link to on the Facebook page for News to Neptune involved Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg in Arizona discussing nuclear war. Thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nickleson, we have a copy of that, and that copy we'll make available. It was a harrowing discussion because Ellsberg has just published a book about his own lifelong involvement with atomic weapons and the U.S. use of nuclear weapons and plans for the use of nuclear weapons, going back to his days as the Rand Corporation as a young man, and before he was involved in the release of the Pentagon Papers, the government's own account of the Vietnam War, dramatized in a not bad recent movie called The Post. Chomsky, as usual, is deeply informed and deeply scary about what the U.S. government is actually doing in regard to nuclear weapons, and has been for some time. I recommend the entire discussion to everyone who has a chance to watch it, even though it will not make you sleep better. I also gather there was another discussion of some sort on campus recently, right, David?
Right. But first, let me ask you. I mean, Chomsky reading the interview, not this interview, but reading the most recent interview that this fellow who interviews him on a regular basis for Truth Out, the guy named Nikru or
something close to that. Greek. Yes.
Sorry.
It was Greek to me too.
Sorry about my Greek.
Yeah.
And Chomsky, in response to questions regarding his views on Trump, he strikes a rather more dour tone than, for example, you, I think.
To take an example at random.
just to pull one out of the hat. So I was just wondering if you have any particular, like when you read this interview, which I assume you did, I think you posted it actually, whether you feel that you would want to sort of dot an I or cross a T or strike a relatively different tone than Chomsky did in sort of covering all these various bases, most of which are true. I mean, obviously the point of light has to do with the relationship between North Korea and South Korea at the current moment, which of course nobody's going to give Trump any credit for, and I don't know whether he should deserve any credit for it, but it happened under his watch, as they say.
Well, and a month ago, everyone was telling us that madman Trump is going to attack Korea with nuclear weapons. So
and then 2 weeks ago, they were saying, well, he can't possibly, nothing good could possibly come out of this visit and this topic. And then in the meantime, the leaders of North Korea and South Korea are meeting, and even the New York Times couldn't manage to sort of throw a little cold water on this meeting. Well, there it is, right in front of on the front page of
the Wall Street Journal.
The Wall Street Journal, just to have a little visual aid. We don't have enough visual aids on this show.
That's too true.
And so, And so, did you react to this interview with Chomsky in any sort of critical way?
Yes, indeed. And I would say the background of this is the fact that Chomsky recommended a vote for Clinton in the last election. And I think that's the first time that I have fundamentally disagreed with a view of Chomsky's since I first heard him speak more than 40 years ago. And I would say that in retrospect, although I still think that the advice was wrong, I voted for the Green Party, as a matter of fact, in the presidential election. That's another issue. But I think it was bound up with Chomsky's own regular observation that it really doesn't make too much difference whom you vote for, and that voting should be a matter of 5 minutes reflection before you go into the booth, because that's about the importance it has. But that said, I think what he has actually said more recently, including in the interview you referred to, is not far from what seemed to me correct all along. Let me read you just a little bit of that to illustrate what I mean. He says, and I think this is a crucial point, Trumpism is one of many manifestations of the effects of the neoliberal policies of the past generation. And by this past generation, he means not only 30 years of presidential administrations, but of the political culture of the United States that those administrations presided over. I think he's exactly right about that. And I've pointed out here before that whatever one thinks of Trump's character, which is what the political establishment wants us to reflect on, the fact of the matter is he was the first major party political candidate in 40 years to attack the principles of neoliberalism and neoconservatism that have guided all recent administrations, Republican and Democrat. That said, back to Chomsky. Trumpism is one of the many manifestations of the effects, he doesn't think they're good, the effects are good, of the neoliberal policies of the past generations. These have led to extreme concentration of wealth, along with stagnation for the majority. We sometimes don't notice how remarkably concentrated wealth has become at an accelerating rate over the last 40 years. There have been, this is Chomsky, there have been repeated crashes of the deregulated financial institutions, each worse than the last. Bursting bubbles have been followed by huge public bailouts for the perpetrators, while the victims have been abandoned. Globalization has been designed to set working people throughout the world in competition with one another, while private capital is lavished with benefits. Democratic institutions have eroded. As already, all of this has led to anger, bitterness, often desperation. One remarkable effect is the increasing mortality among middle-aged whites, analyzed as deaths of despair, a phenomenon unknown in functioning societies. He's talking about, of course, about the U.S. here. While there are variations from place to place, some features are common. One is the decline of the centrist parties that have long dominated political life, as we see in election after election. We've pointed out this before, that the centrist parties, whether they consider themselves center left or center right, Republican or Democrat, decline, and the populist outliers take their place. In the U.S., in recent years, whenever candidates arose from the base in the Republican primaries, the established powers were able to crush them and impose their own choice. Mitt Romney, for example. In 2016, for the first time, they were unable to do so. But they quickly rallied to the winning candidate, that is Trump, who proved quite willing to front for the more brutal wing of the traditional party. The real surprise in the election was the Sanders campaign, which broke with a long tradition of pretty much bought elections and was stopped only by machinations of the Obama-Clinton party managers. The Democratic Party is now split between the donor-oriented New Democrat managers and a growing activist social democratic base. That's Chomsky in the midst of the recent interview, which we will also place on the News from Neptune Facebook page. It seems to me that's exactly right, and that's the set of phenomena that we have been talking about in terms of the populist challenge to corporate globalism. And I think that to understand Trumpism that way is extremely important, rather than nonsense about authoritarianism and fascism and a half dozen other things. And Chomsky seems to me to have one of the few accurate accounts that we find in political discussion these days of what's going on there. If that's wrong, then I'm happy to be wrong with him.
Yeah. Well, the only caveat or footnote I would say to that is that his standard phrase in arguing a vote for the Democratic Party is that he says that in a country as powerful as the United States, small differences between the two ruling parties can make large differences. In foreign policy, that refers to people most likely to have bombs dropped upon them. And in domestic policy, that includes to the vulnerable poor. And I would say, generally speaking, that proves to be true in the domestic front, in terms of whatever legislation has been put forward with Trump. Although I would even draw back from that. As horrible as the tax cut is to the rich, that in and of itself doesn't make the poor poorer. What makes the poor poorer is that when that will be used as an excuse to cut back social programs.
Exactly.
And so that is Chomsky's rationale for voting for Hillary Clinton, and that might have been right in a marginal general sense, in a specific sense in terms of support. But look what you've got under Trump. Not to his credit, but look at the rebellion that you have among teachers in red states.
Good for them.
Would you have had that under Clinton? Maybe, but
maybe, or would there be find some way to buy them off with identity politics of the sort? Well, of course, we have a woman as president now, and a lot of teachers are women, and therefore, I mean, you could write the speech right now. It wouldn't be hard to do. Look, let's go back to the question of war, which in some ways is the more important one. I think the most astonishing thing since the election, in some ways, is not the tergiversations of Trump and his willingness to adopt the very policies that he attacked during the campaign. The most astonishing thing is the way in which the political establishment has blown its cover of being liberal and progressive, and has said that Trump's real sin is he's not pushing the war provocations against Russia and China. Now, this is worthwhile because it makes it clear that American foreign policy, the institutional foreign policy of the United States for more than a generation, has been aggression against Russia and China in the time-honored American political tradition of preventing or retarding the economic integration of Eurasia as a challenge to the economic hegemony of the American ruling class. This was Trump's great sin. He raised the question, wouldn't it be a good idea to do a deal with Russia and with China and work together for the good of all? Now, we're coming out of an administration which had made its stock in trade, the Obama administration, covering over and hiding from the fact that it was remarkably provocative against Russia and China. You just have to look at Ukraine and the South China Sea, which were policies of the Obama administration, to realize that this is true. But their hatred for Trump grew to the fact that he named the game. He pointed out that's what they were doing and said that wasn't a good idea and that we should do deals with Russia and China. Now, in office, he was in various ways made to get with the program and has done so. But look, he's already committed the sin. He's mentioned, the unmentionable for the American political establishment. When we have reversals like the recent Korean business, it's really kind of hard to maintain the political establishment's fiction that the threat to peace is Donald Trump.
And without him being elected and without Hillary Clinton losing, we wouldn't have had this precious gift of Russiagate.
Exactly.
And I mean that in a serious way, that it's so clearly exposed what the Democratic Party is capable of.
Exactly.
The kind of these ludicrous conspiracy theories, and even our friend Louis Proyek doesn't like us using the word neo-McCarthyite to describe what this is. I can't think of a better word if you're old enough to use that word, which both of us unfortunately are. So although I was just a baby, just a little baby. Anyway, so that's one thing. And before, I think a good segue there in terms of the week's news, before we explore the visit of some obscure Jewish man who came to our town, not to run in the Illinois Christi Clinic Marathon, but for some other reason. I noticed the New York Times editorial about the visit of the French Prime Minister. Is he president or president? President Macron. And you have to say Macron if you want to be right about it. I did take 4 years of French in high school, so I don't want to embarrass anyone more than I already have.
You don't have to give him back.
That the New York Times editorialized that Trump was not, that he failed to sway Trump with his quote-unquote Gallic reason. I love that. That's Gallic reason. They didn't define what Gallic reason is. I thought maybe you've read
the dangerous
Baudrillard and Lacan and people like that, haven't you?
Dangerous putting Descartes before the horse,
Descartes,
right?
Yeah. So, but anyway, the antidote to what was going on this week was the fact that this visit, this guy who does represent the New York Times values, who does represent all of the things that people are rebelling against, globalization, and who joined Trump in bombing Syria a couple weeks ago, but that's over and done, and nothing, as we said last week, nothing else has really come of that except people continuing to argue without really knowing what happened in Duma prior to this bombing in terms of this gas attack. I tend to believe that it's probably true, but I don't know either. And I don't think it should depend on whether it's true or not in terms of our understanding of what's going on in Syria and what has gone on in Syria and what we feel about Assad and so forth. So that's the Macron factor that the elites are using. That if only Trump would get into Macron's program after he was done brushing lint off of his suit or whatever. I didn't even hear about this until way after the fact. I'm completely out of the loop.
This is the real news,
This
David.
is what people are talking
Exactly.
about. This is really what people are talking about.
Right.
And trying to make so much more of their body language. And I mean, I don't like Trump. I don't care about his body language. or his body, or the size of anything about his body.
Please.
Okay. Anyway, on to Israel-Palestine. Neither of the word Palestine was not mentioned in two recent Thomas Friedman columns about Israel.
Is he sick?
Well, no. I mean, it's quite telling. He wrote a column entitled, it's something to the effect of, "Are Israel and Iran going to go to war with each other?" Okay, and he didn't mention Palestine, and the other one has to do with the other column, which I found interesting in some ways, having to do with the African refugees that are under some stress in Israel right now, who have fled places like Ethiopia and Sudan. And Israel wants to kick them out, and they're having a little bit of a difficult time in doing so because there are some people that want to focus on this. And it was an interesting comparison that Friedman and perhaps others have made, to call these people dreamers, okay? To call the African refugees in Israel, who managed to get there by walking through the Sinai Desert, or by being transported through there, that they are to be compared with dreamers in this country, in a column that doesn't mention Gaza, that doesn't mention Palestine, this is the fifth Friday in a row that there had been demonstrations in Gaza. At least one more person has been killed, according to this morning's news, bringing the total to about 40. But we don't want to talk about this.
Exactly.
And so anyway, beyond that, just to put a few things on the table here, I had a letter in the paper this morning, which is my response to Alan Dershowitz's visit, a long-running, I mean, that's just one example, one outrageous example of Dershowitz's treatment of the Israel-Palestine conflict, that he was bold enough to at least partly blame the Holocaust on the Palestinian people, based on his understanding of the fact that the leader of the Palestinians at that time spent some time in Germany during World War II, and blah, blah, blah. And of course, it's all just nonsense. The Holocaust had nothing to do with him or the Palestinians or anything else. But that's just the lengths that this man is willing to go to. But more to the point, what are the lengths that this university is willing to go to sort of to pretend to actually debate these issues without really doing so.
Oh.
And that's what I get so tired of, is that these events, which was advertised, which was actually promoted with advertisements in the News Gazette, several, at least 2 or 3 times, telling the broader public, show up to hear the great Alan Dershowitz speak, but not to really discuss anything of any substance, like things that we talk about on this program.
You're watching News from Neptune. We are talking particularly about the visit of a retired law professor from an institution on the East Coast that has been called by Noam Chomsky the Academy for the Passive and the Obedient. And Alan Dershowitz, last night's speaker on campus, certainly is passive and obedient in regard to the standard American Zionist propaganda about Israel, which is what we got a good dose of apparently last night, or those who actually attended the occasion did. There's been a lot of discussion about it elsewhere, and I will say there was one thing about it that actually surprised me, even at my advanced age, and having heard Mr. Dershowitz and his colleagues talk about these things for many, many years, I was still astonished by one point that came up not in the discussion on the floor, apparently, I mean, during the lecture last night, nor in the various writings about it, including Mr. Green's own, but on the television, the Channel 3 report on the event. Dershowitz's particular concern in the lecture surprised me, because it seemed to testify to the growing influence of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, which David has discussed frequently here before. Here's what Dershowitz said, according to Channel 3. BDS think they're going to bring back peace. Interesting phrase itself. Going to bring back peace, and they're just dead wrong. That's another unfortunate phrase, perhaps, but still. This is Dershowitz, I'm quoting. I support free speech. I support their right to tell their lies, and I support my right to call them lies. But I don't support their right to use the kind of economic discrimination that the Nazis used against the Jews in the 1930s when they boycotted Jewish stores, close quote. That was a surprise. That was Alan Dershowitz. And what his real objection to the BDS movement is, according to him. That surprised me. And I was particularly surprised because we've noted here before the cowardly acquiescence of our local liberal legislatures, State Senator Scott Bennett and State Representative Carol Ammons, both Democrats, to the Israeli government's interference in the Illinois legislature on this very matter in support of Israel's racist policies in the territories that it illegally occupies. 3 years ago, Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner signed into law the first ever state action against boycotts of Israeli apartheid, a bill requiring Illinois to identify companies that boycott Israel for its discrimination against Palestinians, and then to withhold investing Illinois pension funds in those companies. This is a state law in Illinois, actively promoted, of course, by the Israeli embassy. Neither Bennett nor Ammons voted against the bill, which had been actively lobbied for by the Israeli consulate in Chicago. That a foreign government should be directing Illinois' investment strategies is bad enough. Russiagate. But that it should be in support of racism, illegal occupation, and human rights abuses is outrageous. It's been observed that apartheid against Palestinians in the territory that Israel illegally occupies is worse than the apartheid regime that existed in South Africa from 1948 to 1994. That system was based on the repression of the black, African-colored, Indian majority of the population for the benefit of the politically and economically dominant group, the Afrikaners. Bennett and Ammons would not have favored South African apartheid a generation ago. That they do so now in Israel is shameful. Another reason that the War Party Democrats, by the way, should not be supported on the state or national level. Now, as I say, this whole thing dropped out of last night's discussion, and that was the one part that surprised me. Were you surprised?
Not in the way that you were, but I'm just trying to think this whole thing through. That the BDS movement is an expression of speech, and its actions, the actions
Sure.
that result from it, should be a protected expression of political speech or behavior. And so if Dershowitz were to be consistent, he would certainly support the right of groups who consensually support the boycott, such as some of the liberal Protestant groups, or the Quakers, or whatever university or whatever student group may have voted for it recently, such as they did at Barnard College.
That's important.
Yeah. So these actions should be supported as political expressions, whatever the results are, the behavior that's results of that results of those processes, whether it's boycott, recommending boycott on an individual basis, or by individuals' consumer choices or travel choices, or academics' choices, whether to consort or not consort with people. There are some gray areas there that may have to do with academic freedom that deserve more consideration. But still, and I think the BDS movement, whatever my criticisms of them, have been careful to avoid that. They say we will work with anybody, just that we don't wish our institution to work with these particular Israeli institutions of higher education. I'm concerned about what the consistency of the BDS movement is in associating with Israel, as opposed to associating, say, not associating with, say, Lockheed Martin for reasons that have nothing to do with that. I'm sort of concerned with how that all plays out and how that makes any sense in what we choose to boycott. But what's come up recently is that, and I really hadn't heard this before, and this was one of the fellows who participates in our friend David Johnson's Labor Hour program, a guy named Joel Reinstein, whom I don't know, and I'm not being personally critical of at any personal level, but what he has stated on the program, and I'll just meet the argument as it is. He says that BDS is a movement, not a tactic. And I had never really heard that before. He says it's a movement in the sense that it represents the rights of the Palestinian people, broadly speaking. And that's usually done in terms of three groups of people. There are the Palestinians living in occupied West Bank and in Gaza. There are the Palestinian refugees living in other countries, some in refugee camps. And then there are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are certainly second-class citizens in this quote-unquote democratic country under those terms. And what he's arguing that the BDS is a movement because it represents the interests of all those people. It includes everyone in, and so therefore, not just its tactics but its strategy are clear as to protect the civil rights and human rights and citizenship rights of all of those people. And that would be certainly a worthy goal in any of those contexts for all those people to have human rights, civil rights, and citizenship rights that go with civil rights. So the problem that I think some people that I might support in this regard, and Norman Finkelstein in particular, argues that the Palestinian citizens of Israel are really not included in this movement in this direct sense, and the movement is better if it's not. That's a separate struggle, and that once you include them, then you're sounding hypocritical, because there are many discriminated against and oppressed groups in many countries, and that Israelis could rightly argue, as they could in other contexts, that as they do speciously in many contexts, but correctly, and perhaps in this context, that Israel is being singled out for having an oppressed citizenship group of people that do participate in this process, that do benefit in some ways from Israel being a relatively advanced industrial developed country. So these arguments may sound arcane, but I think they get to the heart of why the BDS movement is perhaps not as successful in explaining its views and organizing itself and cultivating followers as it claims to be.
There is one reason that Israeli crimes of apartheid are singled out in our discussion, and that is that we are, in a sense, responsible for them.
Yes.
And I don't think we should overlook that. In fact, that should be very close to the center of our reflections on it. Israel could not get away with running an apartheid system in the occupied territories, and maybe even with the occupation, if it were not for the support, political, military, economic, diplomatic, that the U.S. gives to it. And we've talked about this frequently here before, but we should recall the U.S. is not doing that because it's particularly evil or particularly good. The U.S. is doing that because it serves American interests. American interests here being the interests of the American ruling class, and specifically the interests of the American ruling class in controlling the energy flows from the Middle East. If Israel stopped serving the interests of the United States, as some say it did in 1956, for example, the U.S. ruling class would sell them down the river without a moment's thought. The U.S. doesn't care about the discrimination taking place in cadet societies, in our allies. The English can do what they want with the Irish, etc. They don't really care about that. They too care very much about the international strategic situation, which at least until very recently has hinged almost uniquely on the flows of energy out of the Middle East. Israel became an American ally when it destroyed the major threat to American control of the region in 1967. That major threat was secular Arab nationalism. Ever since then, Israel has been as I say, a principal cadet of the United States because it's doing the work. Noam Chomsky uses the image of the Godfather and the hitman. Israel becomes the hitman for the American Godfather in the Middle East. To change the image, Israel becomes a stationary aircraft carrier for Americans' military control of the Middle East. Now, there have been interesting developments in that in recent days, including the emergence with clarity of the Saudi Arabian-Israeli alliance in that enterprise, the enterprise of controlling Middle East energy, and the questions about the usefulness of controlling about Middle East energy. But the crucial point remains that the United States supports Israel and Israel's crimes of apartheid because it's serviceable to the interests of the American ruling class. And that's where Americans should begin to understand what's going on and, quite properly, object to it.
Yeah. Let me just to go back a little bit to underline what you were saying about the anti-BDS movement. It's clear that it's a violation of political freedom of speech. It should have been every legislator in the state. It should be clear that they should have opposed this. Okay, and it's true that our legislators, our two local legislators, abstained from voting as opposed to everyone else who voted in favor of this bill. But still, I think we have a right to expect that they would oppose the violation of the freedom of speech, especially in this instance, given what the obvious agenda of this bill was, and given the claimed enlightenment regarding human rights. This is a matter of which side are you on. And it's clear that we need to be on the side of justice for the Palestinian people.
And we begin that by recognizing how the account we're being given serves American interests, and trying to understand what is actually going on, as Rosa Luxemburg says, and trying to say that clearly. Yeah. You're watching news from Neptune. There are all other things on the agenda.
Well, let me just make a couple more points in that regard. The Palestinian refugee situation is a complicated one. It's a little more gray, in my mind, than either the rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or the occupied territories in West Bank and Gaza, and the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria, which Israel has also occupied since 1967. The Palestinian refugee problem is legally clear. They have a right to come back. They have a right, the UN, by international law, they have a right to either return to their homes or be compensated. But again, I think a pragmatic understanding of the Palestinian rights movement should call for a recognition of those rights, with an understanding that 8 million Palestinians, or however many it is, aren't going to be able to return to within the Green Line, that part of Israel that was established after the 1948 war. That's not going to happen, but that Israel should recognize the rights and in reality allow some of those, just as it allows refugees from other countries. That should be part of any fair settlement to that process.
Compensations and reparations make sense.
Compensations, yes, right, exactly. So that is part of it, and that is perhaps in a way the most difficult part of it. Ending the occupation would be easy, and then struggling for Palestinian rights among citizens of Israel would be a lot easier if the occupation were over, because the occupation has always been used as a way, as a weapon, as an excuse to see the Palestinian citizens, of the non-Jewish citizens of Israel, as a kind of fifth column. There would be no excuse to see them that way anymore, and you would have a proper civil rights movement, just like what you had in this own country, without whatever successes and failures you could have with those kind of movements in this sort of neoliberal context, which is what Israel is, every bit as much as what we are, what Israel would still be, even if the occupation was over. But in any event, it should be over, so we could move on, ending neoliberalism too, whether there or here.
And the occupation would end if the U.S. stopped supporting it.
Absolutely.
This is the point that I think is rarely recognized, but it may be the most fundamental point in the whole business. That's what leads us back to saying, why does the U.S. government in every administration do this?
Yeah. And a relatively obscure fellow who I've never mentioned before on the program, but who I happened to know when I was in college, an Israeli sociologist, political sociologist, Gershon Shafir, has written a handy little book, a sort of turgid but handy little book about the called a half century of occupation, and he points out a lot of interesting facts about it. And one thing worth mentioning in relation to the fact that the Dershowitz's visit was sponsored not by any of the mainstream Jewish institutions in town, but by the Chabad House, or what they call the Chabad Center for Jewish Life, which is a Lubavitcher movement, which is an Orthodox Jewish movement, representing people that traditionally weren't Zionists. But what's happened in the occupation, as Shafir points out in his book, is that about 100,000 what are called Haredi Jews, Haredi, or plural Haredim, have been moved to a couple of the largest settlements in colonized, occupied Palestine. About 100,000 of the 400,000 settlers in West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem, live on the West Bank, and that out of those 400,000, 100,000 are these Haredim, Hasidic. It's a mixture, but various sects of Jews who as I said, traditionally were not Zionists. But what we see here in our town is that the one Jewish institution that was willing, that somehow they corralled in to sponsor Dershowitz was the Chabad House. It's a rather curious thing, and I'm not quite sure why I'm pointing it out, except to say that on the one hand, these non-Zionists, these anti-Zionists, or anti-Jewish state people have become Zionists as a result of the way that the occupation works, and then that the other Jewish institutions like Hillel Federation, Sinai Temple, and so forth did not sponsor Dershowitz's visit, which kind of speaks to where we're at in the Jewish community regarding what it means to support Israel. Kind of perhaps points to the kind of struggles that Natalie Portman has been having lately with receiving awards from the Jewish state, receiving something that I think has been said is tantamount to the Jewish Nobel Prize or the Israeli something prize.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's like the Nobel Prize.
Nobel Prize. Mm-hmm. So just wanted to lay all that out.
Did you know that Natalie was Dershowitz's research assistant when she was an undergraduate at Harvard?
Yeah, I guess I heard that at some point, although it wasn't at the top of mine. And it's also worth pointing out that Noam Chomsky was Dershowitz's counselor in Jewish summer camp.
They were kids together.
In a debate, Chomsky is 12, maybe 11, 12 years older. And so he was a teenager when Dershowitz was a child, and what Chomsky said when he debated Dershowitz at Harvard, I think back in about 2004 or 5. He debated Dershowitz about Israel and Palestine at Harvard, and afterwards he said that the only true thing that Dershowitz said was that he was one of his campers.
I'll put that debate. I have a text of that debate. I'll put that debate also a link to that debate also on the Facebook page for News from Neptune.
Yeah.
You're watching News from Neptune, and there are many other things we want to touch on. David's account reminds me of the late Tip O'Neill, who used to say all politics are local. And there's a sense in which that's true, but I think we've had an example of the way in which local politics manifest or bring about the sorts of very real issues that our rulers, for the most part, don't want us talking about.
I think that what's going on locally regarding Israel and Palestine could matter if people wanted it to matter.
I think that's true.
I don't think people are well organized to make it matter the way I would like to see it matter, and that's my that's my beef. That's my problem right now, in spite of the clarity of some of these issues.
A consummation
moral clarity.
devoutly to be wished.
I love consummations devoutly to be wished.
And
I wish I could have one at some point.
The things that stand against it are general and systemic. The misrepresentation of the political debate in this country has reached heights that even I, growing up in a cynical McCarthyist world, would not have imagined, quite frankly. In that context, we have a series of notes of the censorship issues that have risen in regard to electronic media from our research director, Dr. No, and they are all worth looking at, appalling as they are. I did see this week one account that seemed to me to bring these together in quite a remarkable way. Our friend Jeffrey Sinclair, editor of Counterpunch, published an article by C.J. Hopkins, a playwright who illustrates my long-standing contention that the poets often get there first, a playwright who writes about the war on dissent in the U.S. right now. I think that's very important. Our usual ways of talking about politics in America, left versus right and so forth, really don't fit the situation we find ourselves right now, where we have a political establishment that is busily trying to make sure that certain things are not said. And Hopkins, I think, does the best job I've seen of saying how and why this works. I'll quote a little bit of that for you. In an atmosphere of mass hysteria and paranoia, he chooses his words carefully, those are not thrown off, mass hysteria and paranoia like the one we're living in at the moment, the authorities' narratives do not have to make sense or stand up to any type of real scrutiny. Their primary purpose is not to deceive, but rather to demarcate an ideological territory of acceptable belief, expression, and emotion to which normal people are expected to conform. Beyond the boundaries of that territory lies the outer darkness of abnormality and extremism, which no normal person wants anything to do with. To avoid being cast into this outer darkness, people will conform to the most absurd and paranoid nonsense you can possibly imagine. The global capitalist ruling classes know this, which is why they don't care if you disprove their narratives on Twitter or some disreputable website or a local television show that they've rendered virtually invisible anyway. They are not debating the facts or the truth. They are marking the boundaries of that normal territory and herding frightened people into it. You will be told how people like Michael Savage, Rania Khalek, Alex Jones, Breitbart's entire UK office, Cenk Uygur, Max Blumenthal, Caitlin Johnstone, Glenn Greenwald, The Nation's Stephen F. Cohen, Tucker Carlson, Fox, Vanessa Beeley, various British fascists, like Jeremy Corbyn, and that modern-day Rasputin, Linda LaRouche, are all parts of the insidious Putin Nazi plot to, well, I'm not sure exactly, but I'm pretty sure it has something to do with killing Jews and gassing babies. Would you like to be associated with people like that? Assad-loving, Putin-supporting Nazis? Of course not. Therefore, stay within the limits of allowable debate. That last is mine. The rest is C.J. Hopkins, and his entire article on Counterpunch, I think, does a better job of defining the boundaries of the current mishegas than any we've seen in a while.
And one person who usually goes unnamed in these charges, who writes on Counterpunch every week is Louis Project.
Friend of David's.
If you go, a close friend of mine. And if you go to his blog, you'll find a link to somebody else's blog who wrote a 4,000-word screed, an almost incomprehensible 4,000-word screed on exactly why, from their perspective, what C.J. Hopkins is saying is just nonsense. Is that they're living in this alternative world. They're not, facts aren't facts. But when you compare these 4,000 words and the language that's being used, as opposed to the very clear article that C.J. Hopkins has written, I think you can get an idea of which one has a grasp on what's real and what's not real.
Our research director has written quite a striking piece about the relationship between RT and the BBC. And that's come up in some recent discussions of these matters. RT is the Russian government-sponsored news operation, the same way the BBC is a British government-sponsored news operation. But the fact of the matter is that in recent days, months, years, RT has, to my certain knowledge, been far more reliable than the BBC has. Mm-hmm. There's a good site in Britain called Media Lens that is in the business of pointing out the remarkable propagandistic enterprises of the BBC, which of course go back to the Thatcher years and the account of what was going on in Ireland, which was made up out of whole cloth by the BBC, as our friend Joe Thomas has testified here on this program. Long ago and far away, and well, the wench isn't dead in this case, but in this case, in one case it is, if you mean Mrs. Thatcher. But the point is that the news sources which are being rubbished by the American mainstream media and American political censorship, like RT, are far more reliable than the BBC. For example, see Dr. No's account, which I will put on the Facebook page of News from Neptune. But he enters, I think the pressure is getting to Dr. No, quite frankly. He talks about what the Parliament is doing in Britain, which is on a number of matters not to be believed, but particularly on censorship. And he concludes by saying, not to be confused with Parliament Funkadelic, which was completely uninvolved in those attacks on the media. Unconfirmed reports indicate their attack plan was a funk attack. Bow wow, wow, yippee yo, yippee yay. I think we have to check with Dr. No. In any case,
I am sensitive to fellow traveling. I am sensitive to the charge of fellow traveling, in terms of naivete or not checking my sources. Among the sources that are attacked by people like Louis Project and like the whole business with Alexander Reed Ross and these Venn diagrams that he did about left and right and so on and so forth. There are people that I don't rely on, that I haven't read enough to know whether they're reliable. I don't know whether people like Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett are reliable informants. But I've relied more on people like Max Blumenthal, mentioned there, Rania Khalek, Stephen F. Cohen, people like that. And Robert Fisk, I'm not, like, sometimes Rip Fisk is really good, but sometimes I'm not too sure. I don't really want to rely on Robert Fisk, whether to do with this bombing business, this gassing business, or anything else. But it's one thing to doubt the specifics of what Assad is guilty of. It's another thing to doubt the context in which this is taking place. And it's just amazing to me that so many people simply avoid what they're doing. Is they're not talking about the U.S. imperial context. They're just whiting it out. And it's like, it's Assad, 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 and there's something wrong with you if you don't put anti-Assadism first and foremost, even before opposing U.S. empire.
But if you say things like this, David, you become an apologist for Assad.
Right.
You're an Assadist whether you know it or not, right?
Which is, and you're not, and according to Louis Project, you're not allowed to call that neo-McCarthyism. You just can't do that because he knows what that is, and he's lived long enough to know what that is, and so therefore he's an authority on that. But let me say this on a more provocative note. I think counterpunch, and I realize the whole world isn't counterpunch, and that maybe we rely on it all too much, but I think that Jeffrey St. Clair and Joshua Frank feel that they found themselves not on one side of this, but in the middle of this. Not just because they publish both Project and this C.J. Hopkins, but
you and me,
and yeah, well, not me for a while, but anyway, I think it's a kind of a curious thing because Alexander Reed Ross, the man making these aspersions about red brown alliances and all this business, has published on Counterpunch. He's been interviewed by Eric Draitser on the Counterpunch podcast. Recently, both Frank and St. Clair were interviewed at the same time by Eric Draitser on this Counterpunch, and Draitser went on and on about opposing this red-brown thing, and St. Clair and Frank didn't have a thing to say about it. And I'm wondering where they're coming down. I mean, maybe they're just overlooking this, and that's fine. But I'm getting a little uncomfortable with their kind of acceding to this. And I think one antidote would be for Eric Draitser, in good faith, to have someone like Max Blumenthal on his podcast program, or one of these other people, or Stephen Cohen. But it's not Draitser's style, and this is, I think, to the discredit of Counterpunch, that it's not his style to have people on that don't agree with him about everything, or that at least don't accede to his sort of pontificating about various things. So I think that's a failing, at least of the Counterpunch podcast, and I think that it's partly reflected on what's written on the fact that on Counterpunch these issues have been sort of talked about but haven't really been joined in some ways.
Dr. No has several times sent us remarks, sent us information to support his view that he's increasingly disappointed in democracy now.
Yes.
RT is eating DN's lunch when it comes to debunking the lies that ostensibly explain attacks and wars. Right, Dr. No? I think he's right. You have been watching News from Neptune. For the 17th
I think
week,
actually we still, in case you want to say anything more, we still have, 5 minutes? Or?
I think a minute or two.
Oh, 3 minutes, okay.
You have another comment you want to put in?
Well, no, just in case there was, I guess I would conclude just by saying that I don't rely on RT, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I come to the same place and understand what's going on in Syria. I try not to rely on RT, and there are some things. Amy Goodman still does some decent interviews, especially regarding Israel-Palestine and even covering what's going on in Gaza right now. But still, yes, overall, we should be able to get our news without relying on RT, and then we should acknowledge that RT is free to say some true things that can't be said in the mainstream media in this country.
And we should remember, as the poet Horace said, poets often get there first, even Homer nods. We've already pointed out nodding among Noam Chomsky and the Counterpunch editors today, and the list probably could be extended.
What does it mean that even Homer nods?
Even people who are wise and capable make mistakes.
Oh, okay. Glad you clarified that.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 17th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. This has been an extinction edition because we began with Chomsky's disturbing account of nuclear extinction, which you can find a link to on our Facebook page. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No J.B. Nickleson, the third man on News from Neptune, and No's notes are posted there as well. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.